Wofford College, home of the Terriers, is a rather well-known and well-respected university in South Carolina. It's ranked number 7 on Niche's list of best South Carolina colleges in 2024, and managed to land the number 4 spot on the same list by usnews.com. Today, I'm going to be taking a look at a particularly interesting time in Wofford history, the 1950s and 1960s. But before we get into the super interesting stuff, it's important to take a look at the broader historical context. The year is 1950. Japan has recently surrendered, effectively ending World War II. This means that the majority of Wofford students are World War II veterans, either returning to finish their degrees or entering as freshmen with money from the 1944 GI Bill. And all of Wofford's students are white men, as is typical for universities at this time. Importantly, racial tension in the US in general, but especially in South Carolina and other Jim Crow states, is at an all-time high. The civil rights movement is rapidly approaching the forefront of the political landscape and will only be spurred on by the 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education. This is all taking place against the backdrop of the Cold War and the nebulous but ever-present looming threat of communism. Finally, before we actually talk about Wofford's history, I have just one last thing to get out of the way. Disclaimers. Sources for the specific information that I'll be discussing in this video are scarce, if not straight up non-existent. The best I could do are these articles written on the actual Wofford website by Dr. Philip Stone, the college archivist, and the official Wofford history page, which, as far as I can tell, doesn't have an author listed anywhere. There are also no citations in any of these articles other than a few Herald Journal publications that I just can't seem to find copies of anywhere, so take the quotes and some of the more anecdotal parts of this video with a grain of salt. As previously established, the student body at Wofford in the early 50s was comprised of only white men, about 2/3 of which were World War II veterans. This demographic, as is historically the case, was more resistant than most to social and moral progress. It wasn't uncommon to see professors, staff, and students alike protesting the civil rights movement, labeling it as socially disruptive or even communistic, which was essentially the catch-all term for any political ideas that you might have disagreed with at the time. However, some small groups of students at Wofford were more progressive than others. In 1954, for example, a social science group lobbied for the college to allow local civil rights lawyer and activist Matthew Perry to speak on campus, but were ultimately shut down by Wofford administration, directed by college president Francis Gaines. The most notable of these instances of activism, however, began in 1961, under the new president, Charles Marsh, when students Scott Goey and Daniel Lewis left Wofford campus to join a group of protesters picketing nearby stores that refused to serve black customers. They were reportedly the first white people to join the protest, which was later forcefully shut down by the police, despite being entirely nonviolent. Every single person involved was arrested and jailed, except, of course, for Scott and Daniel, who were temporarily detained before being sent back to Wofford free of charge. This story is telling enough on its own of the political climate of the day, but this was only the beginning. Scott and Daniel were certainly the ideological exceptions at Wofford College, and news of their brief stint as political activists did not put them in good standing with their peers. They were regarded by their classmates with such disdain, in fact, that later that week, roughly 200 students, or about 25% of the total student body, gathered to burn their effigies, which had been hung from wooden crosses near the center of campus. Many of the students present were seen wearing white bedsheets intended to resemble the KKK uniform and were screaming racial slurs, calling for Scott and Daniel to be expelled, and generally just inciting violence. At some point in the night, the herd began to throw eggs and glass bottles at the dorm building that the two boys lived in. The Herald Journal publications referenced in the article allegedly quote one of the protesters present, who claimed that they weren't protesting against Scott and Lewis's beliefs, but that they just didn't like the way they were dragging down the name of Wofford College with them. So don't worry, guys. They're not racist. They just don't want to be associated with any form of racial equality or social justice. And if you implicate them in anything of the sort, they will burn your effigy at the stake. The following day, the two victims left Wofford College, never to return again. It was initially unclear whether or not they'd been officially expelled, coerced into withdrawing, or simply chose to leave on their own, as the university didn't release an official statement on the matter. They did go on record saying that Scott Goey was scheduled to take his final exams from home, but his mother publicly denied this claim, saying that the college made no attempts to contact neither Scott nor his family whatsoever. The events of that week remain a stain on Wofford's otherwise very clean reputation. Just 3 short years after all of this went down in 1961, President Marsh decided that Wofford needed to change. The previous president, Francis Gaines, had started a trend of raising money to renovate the campus's worn-down buildings in order to reignite the Wofford spirit. But with that physical change, Marsh knew that there needed to be some social change, too. If the university were to remain relevant and maintain monetary support, it needed to get with the times. And so in 1964, 10 years after Brown versus the Board of Education deemed segregation unconstitutional, Marsh convinced the Wofford Board of Trustees to officially implement an anti-discrimination admissions policy that promised to admit all qualified applicants without regard for their race. Despite the fact that within the first several years of the new admissions policy, only 2 black students were admitted into the bachelor's program, this was a controversial decision that was met with substantial backlash. In fact, the previous year at South Carolina Methodist Conference, only 20 out of the 1,000 delegates present between Wofford College and Columbia College combined voted in favor of desegregation. That is, on average, a 98% chance that any given Wofford representative voted for segregated policies, something which the Supreme Court had publicly ruled unconstitutional an entire decade prior. Marsh fought an uphill battle to convince his Board of Trustees that his decision was the right one, though it should be noted that his reasons were not rooted in ethics, but rather in financial gain. On Wofford's history page, it says, quote, Marsh insisted that Wofford needed to change its admission policies to be consistent with practices at 63 of the 76 Methodist four-year colleges and all of the Methodist seminaries and universities in order to compete with the state-sponsored schools that were opening their doors to black students, and to guarantee that the college's ability to receive federal financial aid dollars would not be jeopardized. Since this 1964 admissions decision, Wofford has begun moving, albeit very slowly, in a more progressive direction, implementing cultural and academic changes alongside the physical ones taking place. A huge contributor to that progress early on was Paul Hardin III, who, carrying on the trend set up by Francis Gaines and continued by Charles Marsh, became Wofford's president in 1968 and made massive moves to renovate the college's campus. He set up a plan intending to accommodate a growing student body, both in terms of living space and academic freedom. Up until this point, Wofford had stuck very closely to the motto of in loco parentis, essentially meaning in place of the parent. The faculty on campus saw themselves as sort of stand-ins for the student parents, keeping them in line while they were away from home. Marsh thought that it would be healthier if students were allowed greater freedom of thought and more chances to experiment and explore socially. So, in addition to commissioning the construction of Green Hall, the first Whiteman Hall, Ship and Dupree Halls, Millikan Science Building, and a new Old Main Building, Hardin worked with students to create things like the Code of Student Rights and Responsibilities, and a campus union tied to the student government in order to give students more political freedom, a stronger voice for changes happening on campus, and a fair bit of autonomy that they had not previously been accustomed to. He also created the now familiar interim semester, a brief 4-week course period set between the fall and spring semesters. This change was met with mixed reviews when it was first implemented, but students have since grown to appreciate the system as it allows them a bit more freedom in class registration for full-length semesters. Perhaps the most controversial policy that Marsh enacted, however, was the freedom for those of legal age to drink on campus. Prior to 1969, Wofford was a completely dry campus, meaning that no alcohol was allowed on college's premises whatsoever. Marsh believed that this was too harsh a paternalism and that the students ought to have the ability to make their own decisions regarding social conventions like drinking and smoking. Many parents and even some students were heavily opposed to this decision, claiming that students couldn't be trusted to behave responsibly if given too much liberty. And as it turns out, they might just have had justifiable reasons to think that way. Because while researching for this video, I came across something in Wofford history that I honestly could not imagine happening today, neither on campus at Wofford nor in any private school for that matter. At least not in the way that it allegedly played out according to the documentation by Wofford themselves. Imagine it's a cool Sunday evening in 1965, and you just happen to be passing by Wofford College as you're walking home from wherever it is you've spent your day relaxing. As you approach, you see fire trucks and police cars lining the block. You hear shouting and sirens from just past the campus entrance, and you smell smoke. And hot dogs? This was the scene that passersby would have been met with on this particularly memorable night in Wofford history, known by the graduating class of that spring as the Great Food Riot of 1965. Apparently, hot dogs were being served for dinner for the 3rd time that week, and the students had had enough. People began to shout, which quickly led to throwing food, which led to toppling chairs and tables, and soon enough, a mob of hangry students was pouring out of the dining hall, knocking over nearby furniture and generally causing a ruckus. The so-called riot escalated to setting literal dumpster fires, throwing dorm room furniture off of balconies, and various other methods of destructive vandalism. The police and fire department were soon called, but were immediately pelted with water balloons, wet toilet paper rolls, and fire extinguishers upon arrival. Finally, the college dean at the time, Father Logan, grabbed a megaphone from one of the police officers and shouted into it, "Cut the crap." Apparently, everyone immediately obeyed and stopped, which I find a little hard to believe, but again, I only have this one source. One direct quote taken from a page titled 50 Years Worth of Stories on Wofford's official site, presumably from one of the members of the class of 65, it's uncredited, describes the event like this, quote, "Tables turned on their side for fortifications, spaghetti spatting against the floor-to-ceiling windows and sliding down, cops, fire trucks, the mob's parade down Main Street to Converse, where the oldest of traditions, a panty raid, ensued. The overreaching local constabulary sicked the dogs on us, and we called it a day. A good way to cap our years at dear old Wofford College." The overreaching constabulary? Anyway, for those that weren't aware of the apparently very popular 1960s college tradition, a panty raid is exactly what you might imagine. Those good old Wofford boys forcibly invaded the dorms of the nearby all-women's Converse College and stole their underwear, collecting them as prizes, often competing to see who could gather the largest amount before they were inevitably forced out by the police. Needless to say, Wofford College has changed a lot through the years, but it's both interesting and important to recognize the history, the controversies, and most of all, the people that bore it through and made it into the place we know it to be today.